Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been having an amazing Sunday. And as we begin this session, I would like to call upon our chairwoman, Dr. Mrs. Sunaina Malik. And we are very privileged to have her with us. She was the ex-president of the MOS and a very revered practitioner from Aurangabad, not needing a great introduction. Also, to add to her, we have the co-chair, who is our powerhouse, Dr. Neeta Shanbhag, one of the finest teachers with several accolades and a very integral part of the Mulund Ophthalmic Association. We have Dr. Shruti Mittal, who is the convener. She's an alumnus of Shankar Nethralaya and a freelancing practitioner in pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus in Thane and Mumbai. And we have Dr. Rushabh Shah, who's an alumnus of Arvind Eye Hospital and is the director and practicing in Mumbai, private practicing in Mumbai. I would like to hand over this session to Dr. Shruti and Dr. Rushabh. As we want to stick to the time, and in case we have any technical glitches, I just have a request that the second speaker also keeps the presentation ready so that in case there is a problem with loading, we will load the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja, for the introduction. A very good afternoon to all the faculty members, the chairman and the co-chairman. I would like to introduce Dr. Pooja. She will be the moderator for our session. She is alumnus of Narayan Nethralaya and she is currently practicing as a pediatric ophthalmologist and strabismologist in Mumbai and Thane. Now, I would like to invite our first speaker without wasting too much time. Like Dr. Pooja said, we want to stick to our time discussion towards the end. I call upon Dr. Shreya Mehul Shah. She has many years of experience in pediatric ophthalmology and she is the founder of Drashti Nethralaya. Dr. Shreya Shah.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm grateful to Dr. Sunaina ma'am and especially Dr. Hemalini Shah for allowing me to speak on very, very rare topic, which is management of chemical burns in pediatric age group. And we know all the substances which are causing chemical burns. Acid cause less damage, but hydrochloric acid causes is an exception and it does the damage as the alkali does. Sometimes penetrates the posterior segment in first sitting only. There are lots of classification, Huggies, Thoughts, Roper Hall, but we are using newer classification which involves the conjunctiva also. So we'll talk in 5 phases for chemical burn: immediate, acute, early reparative, late reparative, and sequelae. And for all the structures, we'll look into what happens to cornea and conjunctiva. But the first most emergency response is to be thorough wash, preferably with Setter eye wash. And sometimes we may have to use Morgan lens just to facilitate the irrigation. And then proper examinations, wipe out all the chemicals from the fornices and continue examining eye till the pH becomes normal. And when the eye enters into the acute stage, there will be a lots of inflammation, copious discharge. And the goal here is promote epithelial healing, reduce pain, decrease inflammation, and prevent bacterial superinfection. So in grade 1, usually we prescribe antibiotics, steroids, cyclopentolate, and follow at least every other day. But grade 2 to 4 or 6 needs more follow-up. Topical prednisolone for more days, long-acting cycloplegic like atropine, topical broad-spectrum antibiotics, oral tetracycline, and high dose of vitamin C always helps, and control of IOP is must. These patients always have to follow up daily and sometimes after few hours, and sometimes we may have to add as methotrexate also. But what happens, we have done all the listed thing. This 8-year baby had been treated somewhere else and was treating since 1 month. But after 1 month, when we looked, the still line particles were lying under the upper fornix. So don't ever forget to double evert the lead. That is the utmost important. Debridement is the choice of treatment here to restore the corneal clarity, normalize the ocular surface, and prevent glaucoma. The 7-year girl had a Lyme injury, and what we did, we have to debride all the necrotic tissue we took the limbal cell from the normal eye, her own, and then we glued the amniotic membrane on that injured eye uh, with the fibrin glue, and we cut this limbal cells. We segregated on the amniotic membrane to allow it to culture, and then we put the bandage contact lens. So this is after 1 month. We did same procedure. It is called SLATE by Dr. Sangwan. We did same procedure in another boy, and this is 3 months post-op, which was published in IJO also. So when cornea and conjunctiva enters into early reparative stage, they will have mostly symblepharon, may sometime present with diplopia. So symblepharectomy is the choice of treatment, maybe with or without AMG. Simple symblepharectomy sometimes works, but when there's late stage, you need to put amniotic membrane graft. All the time we may not have fibrin glue available with us, so we may suture the amniotic membrane, but don't forget to remove all the scar tissue before going further. Sometime in this patient, to gain normal vision initial period, we may put hole in the central hole in the amniotic membrane. Let's look what happens to lead, socket, lacrimal area, orbit. For lead also in immediate, usually there will be a skin burn, may be associated with thermal burn. But in acute stage, there will be lots of lead edema, so need to take care. When it comes to reparative stage, patient usually presents with ptosis, and this ptosis is because of, again, symblepharon. This 3-year boy had a symblepharon and ptosis. We released the symblepharon and put the mucous membrane graft. So this is 1 month post-op and 3 months post-op. Sometimes patient presents with strabismus just because the chemical has entered to muscle, and also it has damaged the posterior segment, but we may have to regain the motility also. Don't forget to put fornix forming suture here. Sometimes patient presents with entropion, and majority of entropion here is the shortening of posterior lamella. Patient may have trichiasis, and we do ciliary bed transfer special procedure for this tracheitic patient. We take the whole tracheitic bed from the lead margin, partial thickness cut in the tarsal plate put, and this whole bed shifted to 3 to 4 millimeter below and anterior to the lead. So this will not be a problem later on. The same boy had trichiasis, and this is 6 months post-operative. Sometime this girl presented with lots of keratinization. So mucous membrane graft is the choice of treatment here. Properly remove all the keratinized tissue. Properly remove all the keratinized tissue from upper and lower lid, and then mucous membrane is glued on the surface. So similar girl after 3 months. So you can regain the cornea. Again, another girl, we had done mucous membrane graft. Sometimes trichiasis with upper lid entropion comes, lengthen the posterior lamella, or here in this case, we may have to augment. But usually in children, they come with the incailoblepharon. So in this boy, lucky boy, actually his cornea was very good. We cut this band and he was doing very, very good. But in this kind of patient, don't forget to treat amblyopia. Ectropion usually because of scarring. Leg ophthalmos can be there, simply can be treated by tarsorrhaphy, or sometimes we may have to support with the skin grafting. So what happens to lead? Entropion, lengthen the posterior lamella with MMG, AMG. Ectropion, remove the cicatrix and skin graft. Trichiasis, ciliary bed transfer, and lead defect, treat accordingly. What happens to orbit? Orbit usually doesn't come as early unless trauma, but late when they may present with shallow fornix, sailed fornix, obliterated fornix, wet socket, contracted socket with lead deformities, dry contracted socket.
1 minute to
So
go.
treatment here is AMG and MMG. We have to we can put this fornix formation construction and then MMG to put the better prosthesis. So sometimes we may have to support with lead skin grafting to put proper prosthesis, but don't forget to put fornix forming suture or symblepharon ring, or sometimes simple conformer works if you don't have anything. This 3-year boy we had to do canthotomy dermis fat graft, and amniotic membrane to fit the proper prosthesis. So we may not give vision, but give better cosmesis. This kind of patient always needs a lots of follow-up. What happens to lacrimal area usually comes with the canalicular stricture, and conjunctival DCR is the choice of treatment with glass or Pyrex. But we have done our own innovative technique. This is we have designed this modified pigtail probe. So here we just probe the strictured canaliculus upper and lower, and then we have this pigtail shape needle, blunt tip needle, along with the silicone tube, and it comes out through the other punctum, and then we
Dr.
get
time.
yeah,
It's
it's
just
done.
wind up
It's
the
only one slide. So sometimes
Sure.
with intracate DCR we may have to do. So finally, what happens to lacrimal system? Canalicular system, thorough wash but no syringing. Conjunctival DCR is the choice, and in our case, we are doing probing with modified pigtail technique. And when the lacrimal sac is involved, probing with bicanalicular intubation when the puncti are normal. But when the puncti are not normal, we have to go for intracate DCR with skin root. So I conclude with that it needs multidisciplinary approach, multiple surgeries, poor prognosis, and sometimes legal issues also. Thanks to my patients. Thank you all. Thanks a lot. I will stop sharing.
Yes. Thank you for the amazing talk. And we would like to call upon the next presenter, Dr. Ashwin Senani. He is a great teacher, and he's been a teacher to me and practicing at Hinduja, and has a private practice in Mumbai. He's going to be talking to us about screen time and blue light, demystifying the myths, the need of the hour. Yes, Dr. Ashwin, you can start.
Thank you, Pooja. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for this opportunity, BOA. And today I'm going to speak to you about screen time and blue light. Now, we've all had patients and parents asking us these questions all through the pandemic. And sometimes I feel that we're answering these questions differently for different patients, and I thought it would be nice to answer some of these questions scientifically. And so the commonest question we get is, oh my god, my child is on the screen for too long. How much time, doctor, should I allow him to see the screen? Will he get glasses? Will it worsen? Is the blue light harmful for my child's eyes? Does he need to wear blue blocking glasses? How do I prevent all of this? So I thought we'll try and answer some of these questions. Let's see how. Now, there is enough evidence to tell us that screen time affects the body as well. So I thought we'll go through some of these points first. It is proven to be habit forming, and it reduces, it affects the child psychologically as well as socially when screen time goes beyond a certain limit. But most importantly, there is very clear evidence that it affects the cognitive and language development in the younger children, especially below the age of 2 years. There is very good evidence that it disturbs sleep patterns, especially the blue light is something that affects sleep patterns at all ages, not only children. And by virtue of increased screen time, there's reduced physical activity, and that is the association with obesity. So we do know the short-term effects. We are very, very well aware of computer vision syndrome, and dry eyes is a part of it. So reduced blinking and increased evaporation can lead to symptoms of dry eye, and the computer vision syndrome just also includes, neck strain and headache and things like that. But sometimes we forget about the accommodative problems that come along with increased screen time. So there is a sort of an increase in accommodative spasms and accommodative esotropias during this pandemic because of the increased screen time. And so we need to be aware of this condition and pick it up. We're also very aware about myopia progression or appearance of myopia. There's a form of an epidemic of myopia that we are seeing through the pandemic because of increased amount of near work. It is important to understand that this myopia progression is more because of the peripheral defocus during the near viewing task. That is an inappropriate accommodation that is the cause. This inappropriate accommodation stimulates the growth of the sclera, and it's not necessarily due to the screen or the blue light from the screen. So it is important to know that myopia would equally occur with reading a book or a Kindle or any backlit device. So let's understand a little bit about some evidence regarding blue light. Now, there's been an explosion of blue blocking glasses by the online optical partners, and almost every parent, wants to know, schools want to know whether that's something they should be advising children across the board. Now, there is very little evidence, very little clinical studies on blue light damage to the eye. Most of the studies that we have in literature are either in vitro studies or animal studies. There are some studies telling us that it can affect cornea as well. The lens as such acts as a protective sponge, and it absorbs blue light and prevents the transmission of blue light to the retina. And we do know that a younger lens or a child's crystalline lens absorbs more blue light than an adult's crystalline lens. But the main damage that has been proven is of the retina. Still, these are all animal studies. So my studies in rabbits have shown that there is damage to the retina when there is a prolonged exposure to blue light. Probably the only clinical studies we have is ARMD progression post cataract surgery. That is, once you have removed the cataract and now you have an artificial lens. But these were done, before the newer lenses which also block blue light. Now, there is very clear evidence that blue light affects sleep. Our sleep hormone melatonin, it actually has an evening rise, and that's why we feel sleepy. But it is the blue light that inhibits the blue light that inhibits melatonin. Essentially, what it does is it makes your brain believe that it's still daytime, and so exposure to blue light just before sleep definitely affects your sleep pattern. So using a blue blocking glasses or a night mode on your device is something that I do advise my patients, especially for screen just before sleep. If that has to be done, best to avoid that. Now, there's this excellent study done by O'Hagan on blue light damage to the eyes. The International Commission of Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection has already defined the set safety levels of blue light radiation that affects the retina. So what O'Hagan did is he took all the possible computer screens and tabs and smartphones, and he measured the amount of blue light that is coming out of these screens at the maximum brightness. And he found that the levels were less than 0.5% of the exposure limits set by IC and IRP. He in fact even concluded that the blue light coming from the blue sky is far more than the light coming from the LED screen. So he concluded that even under long and extreme viewing conditions, these devices are not a cause of concern for the eye health. I'm talking about only blue light. So some recommendations for screen time. Of course, we give all of these to our patients. I'm just going to enumerate them. Consciously blink, avoid a direct flow of AC or fan on the face. Posture helps not only the neck and the spine, but also keeping the screen slightly below the eye level helps reduce the evaporation. The brightness of the screen should match the brightness of the room, which means if you have a bright room, then increase the brightness. Dim room, reduce the brightness. We all know the 20-20-20 rule, but how many children will remember that 20 minutes have passed and we need to take a break? So you need to bring reminders like 2 chapters or 1 level of the game is over, or put a bookmark, something to remind the child to take that break. Dr. Aarti is going to speak to us about myopia progression. So some of the things that I tell my patients is reduce screen time as much as you can. Online classes have to go on, but take breaks. Should not reduce book reading. 60-minute outdoor activity, avoid screen 1 hour before sleep, and preferably use a television rather than a smaller screen. And of course, visit your pediatric ophthalmologist to know whether low dose atropine is needed. Finally, the biggest question, how much screen time is safe? Well, there are no studies, but there are some recommendations. There are some Canadian pre-COVID studies that have recommended less than 2 hours of recreational screen time. But
I would like you to conclude, Dr. Ashwin.
yeah, this is my last slide. So the online classes, there have been some limits put in by Ministry of Human Resource Development, and they said 30 minutes for pre-primary, 1.5 hours for 1st to 8th standard, and 3 hours per day, 9th to 12th standard. But I don't think any of the schools are following this. Finally, the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended no screen below 18 months, some screen between 18 and 2 years, and 1 hour between 2 and 5 years. And this is all for cognitive development, not eyes. But they said that there is no specific limit for 6 years and older as long as it doesn't interfere with sleep and physical activity. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Dr. Ashwin. That was a really nice talk. Now I call upon our next speaker, Dr. Sunaina Malik. She is a phenomenal medical teacher, an ophthalmologist, and a strabismologist. She has been a founder and honorary secretary of Aurangabad Medical Ophthalmology Association and immediate past president, Maharashtra Ophthalmological Society. She's going to speak on how to counsel a patient with strabismus. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm just trying to share. I'm screen sharing, but I'm not getting my, yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry for the delay. Now, the topic given to me is a very nice one because I like offbeat topics like these, you know, which I can talk about from my experience, which is pretty vast, about 43 years of work in ophthalmology. So I think I am in a position where I can talk about how to counsel a patient with strabismus. Now, the dictionary meaning of counsel means advice, especially that which is given formally. And I would like to tell you how you begin, because you don't begin when you start talking actually to the patient, but the process begins from the time the patient enters your room. You have to observe his or her demeanor, mood, facial expressions, because that will give you a lot of clue as to how apprehensive the patient is, particularly if he's a minor. You have to look for all this in the accompanying parents or guardians who also can be very worried. And all this actually helps when you begin counseling them really. Another point which I would like to make is that when you begin talking about the surgery, please send the child out of the room, because that can be scary for the child to hear. We don't realize it because we are used to that on a day-to-day basis, talking about operations and surgeries. But for lay persons, it can be really bad, and especially for children. So please send them out of your consulting room with an accompanying adult, and then talk to the parents or the guardians, whatever you need to. Now, point to remember is that no matter how many optometrists, counselors, or ophthalmic assistants you have, the final counseling has to be done by you. There can be no other way other than this, because it makes a huge difference to the patient. After all, they are coming for you and no one else. Many times a patient will ask me, "Ma'am, are you going to be doing the surgery?" So I tell them there's no one here other than me, because mine is a one-woman show. So because when you talk to them, it enhances their trust in you. And at the end of the day, that is exactly what matters, why they will agree to go in for surgery or treatment. You know, even if you're doing amblyopia treatment and not just strabismus surgery, that also needs a lot of counseling and trust by the patients in you. What are the questions generally asked and your answers? I've taken it this way. So the first question which is generally asked is it hereditary? Now my answer is it could be, because if there's a family history which is positive, it is possible that it is hereditary, but it may not be also. Then is it treatable? Of course, it is eminently treatable. All of us as strabismologists know that. We have to emphasize on the fact that it is treatable and they must treat it. How is it treated? This depends on the type of squint, associated conditions, but the options which are available with us are optics, occlusion, orthoptics, and of course, operations. Then the next question which comes particularly when the child is small is how safe is surgery on my child? And my answer is it is very safe nowadays, particularly because of modern drugs and new trends in anesthesiology. And anesthetists are very good in pediatric anesthesia. So there's no need to worry on that score. Guarantee. This is a question which every relative will tell you to answer. Will it be 100% corrected? My answer always is there are no guarantees, because there are no guarantees in life. My best answer is I will do my level best, and that's the most that I can do. And I think that generally satisfies the parents or the guardians, because they understand that you can't do more than that. Then the next question is, will it become all right in one surgery? Now, this I've learned the hard way, that you should always tell them about the need for a second surgery. Even if it may not be needed after one surgery, tell them right at the beginning, because I did this mistake once, I did not, and the patient needed a resurgery, and they got the impression that I was trying to fleece them, which was not true. But make it a point to tell them that the child may require another surgery depending on the degree of squint. Now, this is a patient of mine, my very favorite patient. I always show her picture. It was a huge XT. And your answer should be, it also depends upon the amount and the type of the squint. Here, she was absolutely unwilling to undergo surgery, but because of her mother's insistence, and more because she was shifted from the front desk in her office to the back office, she decided that, okay, she has to undergo surgery. She understood that it was a cosmetic problem which was bothering her employers. And this is the result of one single surgery which I did on her. This was the first and only time that I have tackled 4 muscles in one surgery. I never do that. But then she became perfectly all right. So the next question is, will it come back? It generally doesn't, but there are many other factors involved. So we cannot give a promise that it will not come back. Then, especially at marriageable age, will people come to know that he or mostly she has been operated? Of course not, unless you tell them. But when it's a person of marriageable age, when the patient is of marriageable age, especially if it's a girl, I tell the parents to please tell the opposite side about the surgery that has been done, because why should you hide it from them? It is not something that you have been doing wrong. She's corrected, she's perfectly all right. The fact that she's undergone surgery should not be an obstacle in her marriage, but if it comes to light afterwards, she may face the consequences. So better to keep your cards on the table right in the beginning. Will glasses be needed after surgery? Now, this is very important to counsel that squint and refractive error are 2 different things, and they are not to be mixed up at all. Because many parents feel that once we correct the squint, her refractive error will go away. But no, it may not. In fact, it doesn't. We have to treat both the things simultaneously. Now, the $1 million question, of course. How much will it cost? So again, that depends on a lot of things. For example, number of muscles to be operated, etc. And here I'd like to tell you a small incident of a patient that came to me. The father brought his daughter, and after examining her and telling him of the need for surgery, he asked this question. So I told him it will cost this much. So then he came out with, he didn't tell me in the beginning that they had been to someone else. At this point, he told me, but I have shown her to another doctor and he said a lot less than you. So then I asked him, then why didn't you get her operated there? He said, no, नहीं, आपका नाम बहुत सुना था, इसीलिए. So I said, फिर आप ऐसा समझो कि आप नाम के पैसे दे रहे हो, जो एक्स्ट्रा दे रहे हो, वो मेरे नाम के पैसे दे रहे हो. After that, he was quiet. He didn't say anything further. But you do get patients like this who ask you very silly and funny questions, you know. So I acknowledge all my patients for teaching me all of this, so that I can tell all of you about this, especially the newcomers who are beginning their practice. And because sometimes you may go wrong in telling them, and the patient may not stay with you or may not come back to you. But I do acknowledge my patients. Thank you so much. Please stay home, stay safe, all of you. I want to meet up with you personally after all this is over.
Dr. Dr. Sunaina. This was a very relevant and practical topic that all of us need to be taking. And now I would like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Varsha Pandey. She is a private practitioner and practicing pediatric ophthalmology and business since 25 years in Nagpur. She's a regular faculty in state, national, and OC conferences.
Yes, hey everybody, I'll share my screen. Yes. Hello, can you see my slides?
Yes, Varsha, go ahead.
Yeah. First, I would like to thank Scientific Committee BOA for giving the opportunity. I'll be talking on vision assessment in pre-verbal and preschool children. Vision assessment meaning estimating maximum ability to see, and it is defined as resolving power of eye or ability to see two separate points. And these two distinct points will be visible only when two separate cones are stimulated. And the normal standard vision 6/6 is equal to angular separation of 1 minute at fovea. So in adults, it is very simple to assess vision with a Snellen's chart, but measuring vision in pre-verbal and preschool children requires special skill, time, patience, and special tests because the visual system is immature and there is no patient cooperation. So the methods of vision testing in children depends on child's age, abilities, knowledge, and available facilities. We all know the normal visual milestones, but just a reminder, it is helpful in estimating the visual potential. So the maturation of visual system in fixation usually is developed by 2 months, and the response to moving objects by 2 to 3 months, and the pointing to objects and matching form is by 2 to 3 years. So the various tests for vision assessment are grouped in 3 types, like detection acuity test, recognition tests, and resolution acuity tests. The vision tests in infants are the important one is Catford drum test. It is useful in infants and preschool children. It is a detection acuity test. The pendular eye movements elicited as the child follows the oscillating drum with dots determines the visual acuity. The dots of various sizes are there, and the test is done at 2 feet. And the smallest dot that evokes pendular movement determines the visual acuity. But the disadvantage is that it overestimates the vision. Another important test is preferential looking test. These are psychophysical tests based on preferring to fixate a pattern stimulus rather than a blank surface of the same brightness. So commercially available PL cards are available and they can be used in clinics. The Teller Acuity card, these are the simple and rapid testing done for children up to 18 months, and it is modification of preferential looking test with the 17 cards are there. And the highest frequency grating which is seen gives the measurement of acuity, and it can be converted into Snellen's notation. But the drawbacks is that the test is for near acuity and it may miss myopia and sometimes it overestimates vision. In the Cardiff Acuity cards are based on the principles of preferential fixation on cards. So cards have pictures of vanishing optotypes. There are 2 dark lines with various width of space in between. And depending on that width, the pictures vanish at some distance. And the optokinetic nystagmus drum traversing slowly before a normal infant's eye produces involuntary jerky nystagmus, and the smaller the target producing optokinetic nystagmus indicates better visual acuity. But again, visual acuity cannot be graded with this. VEP is another highly advanced test to determine the integrity of the nerve transmission from eye to occipital lobe. It is a non-invasive test done monoocularly, and it records the electrical signals generated by occipital cortex in response to visual stimulation. It is an objective record of underlying visual pathway. It excludes organic pathology, and the stimuli can be pattern or unpatterned flash, and we can have flash VEP, pattern reversal VEP, or sweep VEP, which this sweep VEP is important in cases where the vision is very poor. It produces 20 stimuli in swift fashion, and it is a rapid test, and it can be done in just 10 seconds and can give you an idea in very kids with infants with poor vision. But again, disadvantage is that it overestimates vision. It is expensive, it is time consuming, and most of the time it is not available because of the availability, it cannot be done in all cases. So what all these tests are there, but I would like to emphasize more on this, the indirect assessment of visual acuity in infants. And this is very important and practical, and everybody, general ophthalmologist also can get an idea about vision. If we take a proper brief visual history, if the examination of anterior and posterior segment is done nicely, detailed, and then the pupil reaction, presence of squint and nystagmus, then cycloplegic refraction, blink reflex, Bruckner's test for screening, and fixation reflex. These tests will definitely give us an idea about the vision. Then the reflex response, the baby blinks at birth in response to sound or touching the cornea. So blinking on approach of the object by 5 months. So clinically, this blink reflex gives an idea. See, even if it is taken so close, the infant is not looking at the object. Then the fixation again is a very important, fixation reflex is again a very important point to be noted. It is present at birth, and it is an important clinical test well established by 2 months. It is practical and easy. Here we can just see, even if the light is thrown to the, so there is no response, there is no fixation even to the bright light. So that gives us the idea that the vision is very poor in this infant. And the type of fixation, central steady fixation, is a very, very important examination, and it will give you a good idea about the, if the fixation is central, that means he is fixating at fovea steady, there is no nystagmus, and it is maintained, means there is no ocular dominance. And this should be observed by both eyes open as well as separately. And if this chart, everybody knows about this chart, and it definitely gives a very good idea about if the vision is very less, like if there is gross eccentric fixation, the vision is less than 1 meter. And if there is a steady central fixation but it is not maintaining, then it could be 660 to 636. If there is a central steady fixation, prefers other eye, then it could be better vision between 624 to 69. And if there is central steady fixation freely alternating, that means vision is good in both the eyes. Then another important test is if the child is fixating with only one eye, preference of fixation, like in unilateral squint in this case, the other eye, right eye, is not taking fixation at all, indicates amblyopia or poor vision in the right eye. And so this good examination definitely tells us the amount of vision the child is having. Then resistance to closure of one eye. If you try to cover her left eye, the child will cry and will try to remove the cover. So indicates poor vision in the other eye. Then induced tropia test is 10 prism based down in front of apparently fixing eye. Normally it causes both eyes to jump up if there is a good vision. Just one. And if there is no vertical movement, then the vision is poor in the fixating eye. Then in between 1 to 2 years of age, the child's attention is easily distracted after 9 months. So Teller acuity cards, Cardiff acuity cards are not useful. We can have Boyke candy test, where small edible candies of 1 to 2 millimeter size shown from a distance of 33 centimeter. And if there is difficulty in picking up, that means the vision is less than 24. And again, in this, each eye can be tested separately and difference is noted. Ivory ball tests, these are balls of different sizes rolled on floor, and the smallest ball picked up will give you about vision of that kid. Then in between 2 to 3 years, miniature toys tests, coin tests, dot visual acuity tests, smallest dot identified correctly on the illuminated box will give you idea about vision. Then Allen picture cards are also useful in preschool children. These 4 plastic cards. Yes, just my last slides, madam. So these are the various tumbling EC, Sheridan tests. These are all in the 3 to 5 years of age group, and these most of us are using in our OPD. So just to conclude that visual acuity tests in pre-verbal children needs expensive test material. They are operator dependent, time consuming, and did not give correct vision always, and may overestimate, may miss amblyopia. So purely objective tests like VEP can give you idea, but it is mainly in the institutional setups, costly, and so may not be available always. So most of the time, I think the careful examination, observation of the child is must, and it gives important clues about from the fixation pattern and response to occlusion. And another important point in testing vision, that establish a good rapport with the child and the parents. the reward for positive responses. Exam should be more fun than the test, and several tries at different times within the child's attention span will give you a good idea about the kid's vision. Thank you. Thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Varsha. It was a really nice presentation. We move on to our next speaker, Dr. Bhaskar Khare. He is presently working as a professor and is head of the Government Medical College at Ambe Jogai. He has a special interest in oculoplastic surgery. And this topic for today is community approach to management of a squint. Dr. Bhaskar.
I'll stop the sharing. Just a minute. Yeah.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, BOA, for giving me this opportunity to share my experience of community approach in the management of squint. I dedicate my presentation to all my patients. This was a teamwork done by 3 different departments of the government of Maharashtra, which includes education department, which provided the funds, the equipment, and the drugs required for this management of the patient. The public health department provided the infrastructure required for doing treatment of the patient, and the medical education department, from here the expert manpower was provided. This was a prospective study done for consecutive 3 years in the 3 districts, which included Ahmednagar district, Bid district, and Latur district. All the students were from the Jilla Parishad school from 1st standard to the 10th standard. This is done under the school health screening program, and the screening was done at 3 different levels. The primary screening of the students was done at the school level by the school teachers, and students with some ophthalmic problem were listed out, and then they were referred to the PSCs or rural hospital for the secondary screening level. At the PSC level, the students were examined either by the medical officer or the ophthalmic officers posted over there, and the students with specific ophthalmic problem who require further treatment were again referred for the final screening to the civil hospital. At the civil hospital level, all the students were examined by the ophthalmologist, and accordingly 4,636 students were examined at the civil hospital level by the ophthalmologist, and these are the some of the problems which we could find out in all the students. The refractive errors were present in almost 75% of the students. The squint was observed in 15% of the patients. 3% of the students were having congenital ptosis. 1% of the students were having congenital cataract, then vitamin A deficiency, congenital malformations, congenital glaucoma, ocular trauma were some of the other ocular problems observed in the students. Now, all the squint patients, we know that squint is nothing but the misalignment of the visual axis. In simple word, it is nothing but the deviation of one or both the eyes. Physiologically, squint can be because of the hereditary reason. The refractive errors may be responsible for the squint. There may be developmental delay. In some patients, there may be anatomical cause, or there may be innervational anomaly. The thorough examination was done in all patients, which included detailed history regarding the squint. For example, since when the squint is present, is it since birth or it is acquired, whether the one eye is deviating or both eyes are deviating, whether the squint is alternating, and whether it is stationary or increasing. All these points were noted. Then general examination of the student was done, and thorough ophthalmic checkup was done in each and every student, which included recording of the vision of the both eyes, doing cycloplegic refraction in each and every case, and redistribution of spectacles was done whenever the child was having refractive error. Fundus examination was done to rule out any fundus pathology responsible for the poor vision. Then cover and uncover test was done to know whether there is presence of pseudosquint or true squint, or there is any heterophoria in a given case. Whether the squint is unilateral or bilateral, it was noted. Whether the squint is, whether the child having esotropia or exotropia was also noted. Hirschberg's corneal reflex test was used to know the degree of squint, and depending upon the whether the reflex is in the center of the pupil or at the pupillary margin or at the limbus, the degree of squint was recorded. Extraocular movements were tested and the sensory evaluation was done. So these are the observations. All the students were in the age group of 15 to 16 years. Boys were, there were 298 boys and 400 girls. Esotropy was present in 380 students and exotropia was present in 316 students. Going about the degree of the squint, the 15-degree squint was present in 65 students. The maximum number of students were having 30-degree squint, that is 503 students were having 30-degree squint, and 130 students were having 45-degree squint. Regarding the management of the patients, they were examined for the refraction, and whenever patient was having refractive error, the spectacles were prescribed and given free of the cost. The surgery was planned for the residual squint, and before doing a surgery, preoperative counseling of the patient, that is students, parents, and the teacher was done. This is how we did the screening and counseling of the patient. Now, the students selected for the surgery, the criteria was patients with the concomitant squint, either ESO or exotropia. Only patients with horizontal squint were included. The students with any vertical component, or students with any other ocular abnormality, or students with any problem with the extraocular movements were excluded. The goal in doing surgery was to make the eyes straight and to improve the vision. All the patients were operated under general anesthesia using short ketamine without intubation. Standard.
So to conclude.
Using standard recession and resection technique. One muscle was operated in with 15 degrees, with 30 degree squint, 2 muscles were operated, and with 45 degree squint, the surgery was performed in 2 settings in 2 eyes. This was the follow-up done for almost 1 year. In under correction was seen in 10% of the cases, and no any other major post-operative complication was observed. These are some of the pre-operative and post-operative photographs. In 90% of the patients operated, orthophoria was observed with good cosmetic correction and good patient, parent, and teacher satisfaction. So in the society, the squint patients, it is supposed to be a stigma, and they are not accepted in the society. And moreover, as the Malik Madam has mentioned, whenever the girls become of marriageable age, again there is problem. So the take-home message is the squint is one of the treatable cause of childhood blindness. Knowledge about the squint and its correction should be imparted in all the schools and particularly to the teachers. Proper parent and patient counseling is must before doing squint surgery. So to conclude, early detection and management of the squint will improve the cosmetic appearance, will improve the school performance, will improve the mental and psychological development of the child, which will lead to healthy child, healthy society, and healthy nation. Because after all, it is about the vision, it's about the children, and it's about the nation. I would like to thank my team for giving cooperation during all this work. Thank you for patient listening.
Thank you, sir. Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Rebecca. She's an associate professor in strabismus and neuro-ophthalmic services at RP Center, AIIMS, and has over 70 publications to her credit. And she's going to be speaking on amblyopia and recent advances. Thank you.
Rushabh, before she start, I want to say something about Bhaskar. Bhaskar is my guru also. Bhaskar taught me oculoplastic surgery and squint surgery in Ambi Jogai. Thank you, Rushabh.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Himalini, for having me here. And I'm quite delighted to share this platform with such amazing speakers. So, the topic for today, it's amblyopia and recent advances. Well, amblyopia is something that, becomes an obstacle in the management of most of the diseases that happens in childhood. And so I would just brush up the few basics and then come on to the recent advances. So coming to the definition, well, it's the decrease in the vision in one or both the eyes that's caused either by the abnormal binocular interaction, as we see in case of strabismic amblyopia, or a pattern vision deprivation that we see in case of the refractive or visual deprivation amblyopia. And this occurs during the critical period of visual immaturity. That's the initial 2 to 3 years. Well, it's broadly classified into these 3 types, and another 4th type is a reverse of the occlusion type that may be seen as a consequence of overtreatment with occlusion. And visual deprivation amblyopia, well, it's the most difficult, the most severe form of amblyopia, the most difficult to treat. Well, pathophysiology, it has been given by the pioneering work of Hubel and Wiesel that we all know. They showed that how the ocular dominance columns in the eye received, basically ocular dominance columns that receive the input from the amblyopic eye, they tend to become shrunken, while those receiving from the better eye are expanded. So it would be, not wrong to say that amblyopia is a neurodevelopmental anomaly. So in the workup, well, workup consists of a basic vision assessment. Pre-verbal children, it can be challenging, and that has very well been beautifully been described by Dr. Varsha. You have to check for ocular motility. Do rule out an organic cause, because we should first be very clear that it's an amblyopia and not an organic pathology. Otherwise, the management is going to fail. Check for the sensory functions like binocularity, stereoacuity. Prevention is very important. That can be done by early screening of children, by prescribing appropriate refraction, and by treatment of any underlying cause, if any, like a cataract, etc. Then comes your management. Well, before we start with the management, the main thing is that efficacy of any management of amblyopia decreases with increasing age. So important is the early identification and the early initiation of the amblyopia therapy. Well, the conventional therapies are the optical correction, occlusion therapy, or penalization. And the newer ones that are evolving are the active vision therapy, pharmacotherapy, and perceptual learning. Whatever be the therapy, there are a lot of factors that influence the outcome after the management of amblyopia. The important ones being what is the age of starting the therapy, baseline vision, type of amblyopia, density, compliance. Compliance or adherence to therapy is a very important factor that determines the outcome. So first step in the management becomes the optical correction. So you do an age-appropriate cycloplegic refraction and prescribe the glasses. Well, PEDIC studies, the amblyopia treatment studies have shown that just with refractive correction, you can obtain significant improvement in cases of not only in refractive amblyopia, but also in cases of strabismic or mixed amblyopia, and as well as in older children up till 17 years. So maximum improvement is seen in the initial 4 to 12 weeks. That's referred to as the refractive adaptation period. Then the next step is the occlusion therapy. The occlusion therapy still remains the gold standard for management. And what's the best way to do it? Well, you apply an opaque adhesive patch onto the skin of the better eye, but remember, ask the child to wear the refractive correction over it. So it causes a preferential stimulation of the amblyopic eye. So occlusion therapy could either be a full-time occlusion, could be a part-time occlusion. Well, full-time occlusion, it could be given in preschool children. It causes a faster recovery, but there is a higher risk of occlusion amblyopia. Part-time occlusion has been preferred by amblyopia treatment studies, and they have shown that in severe amblyopia, 6 hours of patching is equivalent to a full-time patching. In moderate amblyopias, 2 hours of patching is equivalent to 6 hours of patching. So basically the gist is you start with lower duration of patching, lesser duration. And if the child is accepting it, if the vision is improving, continue. But if there is no improvement, then you can consider jumping to a greater duration. Plus, we can also add various adjuvant near activities like, a high eye-hand-eye coordination task or Activision therapies, etc. So usually an improvement is expected in the initial 3 months, but if there is no improvement in the amblyopic eye on 3 bi-monthly follow-ups, well, it's defined as a failure. And the most important factor that leads to failure is the poor compliance. So it's always a good idea that you counsel the parents and then counsel the the children about the importance of the therapy, motivate them at the initiation. Otherwise, the chances of failure are quite high. Then maintenance, yes, do not abruptly stop the occlusion therapy once your vision has been fully or maximally improved. Rather, you should have a maintenance duration of around 1 year usually, and in which you gradually decrease the duration of your occlusion. Otherwise, the risk of recurrence is there. And recurrences are most commonly seen in the first year of stopping the treatment. So a maintenance therapy followed by an observation follow-up of at least 1 to 2 years is always a good idea. Now, newer occlusion therapies that are being tried are the intermittent occlusion therapy. An example is the liquid crystal glasses using Ambly's glasses. Well, they tend to alternate between opaque and transparent phases. It's believed to be more child-friendly. Compliance is expected to be better. It's a promising technology, but there is paucity of literature. So, yet evolving. Penalization, it's a form of partial occlusion. So, it's more effective in cases of mild amblyopia or as a maintenance or weaning off therapy. Now, it could be either optical, using overcorrecting plus glasses that causes a distance blur, or it could be Banjota's filters, which are stuck to the back of the glass. Then pharmacological penalization using cycloplegics like atropine, it tends to cause a near penalization. And amblyopia treatment studies have shown that even a weakened atropine dose is quite effective. So it's quite convenient for the children to put it, and the compliance could be better, but remember it's only for mild cases or maintenance cases. Then newer alternatives, we have the pharmacotherapy. Well, the basis is that it tends to augment the CNS plasticity. So we can the most commonly used drug is the levodopa. That's a dopamine precursor, and it's an important neurotransmitter in the visual cortex. So there are contradictory reports, but it has been seen that higher doses, especially in treatment-naive cases, can show improvement. Then citicoline is another neuroprotective agent, and oral formulation is available for this. So there are lack of well-designed RCTs in this, but we did a RCT from a center, that is Dr. Vishal's thesis, in which he compared citicoline as an adjuvant to occlusion therapy versus a placebo drug that was given orally, adjuvant to occlusion. And it was found that the ultimate recovery was the same at the end of 6 months, but definitely the citicoline group had a faster recovery. So we must keep in mind about the various side effects before prescribing these therapies. Then comes the Activision therapy. It could be just simple near vision tasks that requires hand-eye coordination or video games. So the possible role is that it stimulates your visual processing and thus enhances the cortical plasticity. So it could be a monocular video game therapy. This is a thesis published from our center, Dr. Archita's thesis, where she found that monocular video games as an adjuvant to occlusion therapy shows significant visual recovery, much more than the occlusion therapy alone in children, and isometropic amblyopes less than 10 years. Dichoptics. Well, 2 eyes are better than 1, so that's the basis of dichoptic therapy. Here you are giving 2 independent stimuli to each eye. In the amblyopic eye, you present a better contrast image. In the better eye, a lower contrast image. You decrease the difference between the two as the binocular functions improve. So you can use any of these dichoptic games, the Tetris game with red and green glasses, Dig Rush game, and it has shown to improve visual acuity and even binocular function.
I could conclude. We are over time.
Just 2 more slides, 2-3 slides.
Yes.
So a study from a center, it showed that we got superior results with dichoptics in terms of contrast sensitivity and stereo acuity. But the PEDIC study did not concur with the same. However, in both the studies, what we noted was a poor compliance because of the repeated play. So there is need for more engaging games. So as of now, we can say that dichoptics are not better than patching, but it can be used as an adjuvant to patching. Other methods are using dichoptic movies or interactive binocular treatment system. VR display, yes, that's a new trending thing. You use VR display, the headsets and the softwares are there. So it's still evolving. It seems to be quite promising. Perceptual learning, well, it could, we had the experience of using Revital Vision where you give these GABA patches to the patient, but still an equivocal response was seen. So I think it still needs a little more development. And these are a few other options that have been tried like acupuncture, transcranial magnetic stimulation, but doubtful results. In adults, well, I would say that PEDIC has shown that occlusion and refraction both tend to improve the vision even in adults up till 17 years. And even beyond that, up till the early 50s, it has been seen that you can add the adjuvant therapies like pharmacotherapy, active vision therapy, or perceptual learning. So I think this is in brief about the recent advances in amblyopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rebecca. That was an informative talk. We would move on to our next speaker, Dr. Charuta Bape. Dr. Charuta is a practicing pediatric ophthalmologist at Nashik. She's an alumnus of CMC Vellore. She's gold medalist from Tamil Nadu MGR University, and she's done her fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya. Over to you, Dr. Charuta.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you, BOA and Dr. Himalini, for giving me this opportunity. I'll be talking about management of trauma in the pediatric age group. Trauma is an important cause of preventable unilateral blindness in children, and it can cause a lifetime disability. The common causes, as you can see here, are bow and arrow injuries, firecrackers, sharp pencils, shuttlecocks causing blunt injury, scissors, and hooks in the case of infants. The pediatric ocular trauma score is used to prognosticate penetrating traumas at the initial examination, and along with vision, they have the age of the patient, the wound location, and concomitant eye pathologies. Now, there are some problems in pediatric trauma which are different from that of adults, and that is a delayed presentation and lack of proper history many times, because it's some time before the parents realize what's happening. You're surrounded by anxious relatives. There is difficulty in pre and post-operative examination. No matter how good your surgery is, the visual outcome is always limited by amblyopia. There can be severe inflammatory response, and considering their long life expectancy, you have more disability-adjusted life years to account for. In the primary management, you should take a proper history to rule out polytrauma, IOFB, etc. Try to assess the vision, but do not use force to examine. If the child is uncooperative, defer the examination till GA is given. In the meantime, in case of an open globe injury, you can patch the eye. Confirm the immunization status, and if the child is not immunized, then you can give TT. Start oral antibiotics, no topicals, explain the emergency of the situation to the parents, ask for a GA fitness, and keep the child NBM in the meanwhile. Give a full idea about the expenses. Make sure all this is properly documented. If a B scan is required, it's better to defer till after the primary repair, because a gentle B scan on the closed lids is generally not possible in children. And if an IOFB is suspected, then a CT orbit with 1 to 2 mm cuts, axial and coronal, can be asked for. During the counseling, the presence of parents and immediate relatives is essential. And like Malik Madam said, the child can actually be sent out. A video recording is a good idea. Explain about the risks of GA, guarded prognosis, possibility of multiple surgeries, need for glasses, amblyopia treatment, and a lifelong follow-up. An informed consent, both for the general anesthesia and the trauma repair, is very essential. Now, just going to some individual types of trauma. In lid and lacrimal trauma, a proper layer by layer alignment, preferably under the microscope, of the toe lid margins is essential. For marginal sutures, a mattress suture is essential with a little bit of pouting at the end to avoid notching of the lid margin. And in canalicular tears, particularly in small children, take your time to localize the torn end of the canaliculus and repair it by putting a stent like a mini Manoka. This is just the outcome of a child who had a lid tear. Now, regarding the principles of corneal tear and traumatic cataract, I'll just speak as the video plays. It's essential to put in the speculum gently under the microscope, clean the wound properly. It's a good idea to stain the capsule with a dye for proper visualization. Before suturing the wound, it's very essential to sweep and remove any iris tissue or cortical matter that is stuck into the wound. The suturing is done with a 10-0 nylon. The margins of the wound are not grasped. You should not hold them with the forceps. The globe should be well inflated before putting the suture so that they're not too tight or too loose. The suture should be through 90% depth and perpendicular to the wound. All the sutures should be equidistant. And it is very, very essential, particularly in children, to bury all the knots. You can take your time to do that, but each knot has to be buried. Then for the traumatic cataract, the torn capsule can be tackled with a combination of the cystitome and the side port rexus forceps. The direction of pull should always be towards the center of the globe to avoid running of the capsule. And if you're stuck, then the VR scissors can also come into play to release the capsule. And it is very important to do a thorough cleanup of all the cortical matter as much as the visualization permits in order to limit the post-op inflammation. If a PC rent is suspected, then a combination of vitrectomy along with the IA should be used so that we are sure that we are not pulling on the cortex. We're not pulling on the vitreous. This picture shows equidistant sutures perpendicular to the wound at 90% depth with buried knots. And the picture on the right shows a good outcome after a corneoscleral tear and traumatic cataract surgery and a secondary IOL. When we plan to do secondary IOLs in these children, we'll either put them in the sulcus or do an SF-IOL. It's important not to delay the secondary IOL too much because we want to minimize the amblyopia. So within once everything is settled in 2 months, we can go ahead. Slow tapering of the steroids is essential because children have a great inflammatory response. Topical NSAIDs are not that necessary in children because CME is not too much of an issue, but PCO is a big issue, and so posterior capsulotomy and anterior vitrectomy is required if the PC is intact. And also don't forget the proper IOL power calculation. The age-related undercorrection of 20% below 2 years and 10% above 2 years is essential. And also consider the refractive correction of the other eye because we do not want to create too much of anisometropia, particularly in good prognosis eyes. In scleral tears, it's important to assess the posterior extent fully. If the tear is going behind, we can use the railroad technique where we leave the sutures ends long and pull them in order to go behind. And if the tear is going under a muscle, then we may need to disinsert and reinsert the ocular muscle while suturing. If it is a scleral perforation, we have to suspect an IOFB and we may need the help of our vitreoretinal colleagues to remove the intravitreal foreign body. Just a few pointers about vitreous and retinal trauma in children. The placement of sclerotomy in children is closer to the limbus 2 to 2.5 mm and should be done after visualizing the pars plana. It's preferable to suture the sclerotomy. PVD induction is more difficult, and if you're suspecting a traumatic endophthalmitis, it's better to give an intravitreal antibiotic while the child is under GA. Also suspect traumatic glaucoma. Yeah. And you can check the pressure by tonopen or Perkins tonometer under GA. Orbital trauma can also occur. And for example, this child here had a blowout fracture. and it was recognized and treated initially with steroids and surgery with mesh within 2 weeks. And that restored her ocular motility and her head tilt to normal. And last but not the least, don't forget the post hoc visual rehabilitation. Your work doesn't end with treating the trauma. Insist and persist on glasses and occlusion therapy. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charuta. That was a beautiful presentation and extremely well depicted. I would now like to call upon Dr. Aarti Kabra, and she's going to talk to us about COVID and myopia. Dr. Aarti is the director at Jhambar Eye Hospital in Pune, and she is a fellow of Shankar Nethralaya, and she has done extensive work in community ophthalmology, strabismology. Dr. Aarti, you can start. We can now see your screen, but we cannot hear you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yes. Thank you, BOA and Hemalini, for giving me this opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk on, after an extensive scientific discussion on various topics, today I'm going to talk on something different, a new terminology that we all have been introduced to, that is the quarantine myopia. Myopia, as we all know, is a major health issue around the world. WHO estimates that around 50% of the population will become myopic by 2050, and various factors that go in favor of this are insufficient time spent outdoors, duration of the work that we are doing indoors, and the intensity of the work. Now, COVID-19, which we all are dealing with here right now, has definitely played an impact on all of this. About 80% of students from more than 130 different countries have been affected by this quarantine myopia. And what are the main causes? The traditional classroom learning has now been replaced by a lot of digital work and e-learning. And thereby, the link between COVID-19 and the current pandemic and myopia is quite obvious. Most of the school children are sitting at home because of school closures. There has been a shift to online learning and more screen time. In view of the social distancing, kids are sitting together indoors and doing more screen use. There is fear of community spread due to outdoor activities, and hence there is significant decrease in all of this. But most important of all this, which I feel I have experienced in my practice, is the delayed diagnosis. Now, what do I mean by this? Previously, when a child was not able to see a blackboard, the parents would immediately bring them saying that the child is not able to see for distance. But now, because of the extensive indoor use of gadgets, the child hardly sees anything outdoors and a far distance thing. That leads to delay in the diagnosis of myopia. Secondly, inability to reach the hospital for eye care is another factor which is causing the delay in the diagnosis. Most parents are doing work from home now, and hence they are also spending inordinate time in front of the screen, which has definitely affected the role model image of the child. Because of the work from home, parents tend to use different devices as a calming medium for the children, which has to be avoided. From 2015 to 2019, the prevalence of substantial myopic shift has been estimated in an article in JAMA, which says that there's almost a 400% increase in myopia in 6 to 8 years of age group of children. And 9 to 14 years does not show much change in this study, but I'm sure most of you would agree that even this age group is significantly affected, as we all see in our practice. The main issue being excessive gadget use and reduced outdoor activities. Now, excessive gadget use, as we all know, and as Ashwin has already discussed, causes digital eye strain, dry eye disease because of reduced blinking, and definitely myopia progression because of sustained near work and closer working distance that leads to progression. Most children are at risk to this, but some high-risk children are those with a history of myopia in one or both of the parents and a lesser hyperopic error that is found in cycloplegic refraction. Also, children studying in schools with some excessive academic pressure tend to be at more risk. So again, repeating, how will the child present? The digital strain may present like an accommodative spasm because of excessive gadgets being excessively used without adequate breaks. Also, there will be dry eye disease, because of which there will be irritation and burning redness of the eyes. And of course, myopic progression because of sustained near work. So sudden unexpected jump in myopia should arouse an suspicion for myopic progression. Accommodative spasm can be seen as a sudden jump and progression in myopia, and hence it is important to rule out by doing a proper cycloplegic refraction in all children and also comprehensive assessment of binocular vision. Besides cycloplegic refraction, it is also important to document the eggshell length by ocular biometry in each and every child whom we are suspecting to have a myopic shift. The children whose eggshell lengths are greater than 26 millimeters need to be followed up at regular intervals because they tend to have more risk of visual impairments. So what is the solution? So as we all know, difficult problems usually have very simple solutions. First, there is a definite role of the education system in this control of myopia. The education system needs to have encouraging children to participate in outdoor activities, or rather I would say non-screen based indoor activities, thereby encouraging positive screen time. Most important, I feel, is the solution at home. More than a healthcare professional or an eye doctor, I think the home plays more role in all of this. The home should have a definite digitally free zones inside the house. There should be digital fasting time and rules applied. Kids should be encouraged to do some outdoor work as well as digital hygiene, including appropriate posture, adequate lighting, and proper distance from the screen should be taught. The rule of 20-20-20, as Ashwin has mentioned, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more again, has to be taught. Encouraging students to take breaks, a healthy or a positive screen time, participating in indoor physical activities, and co-activities along with other household members such as cooking, baking, cleaning has to be encouraged. Now, how much should be the screen time? Again, there are many studies going on, many articles have been published. There is variation about the thought of this, but commonly I would say that the children less than 2 years should not be exposed to any kind of screen except occasional video calls from the relatives. Children between 2 to 5 years should not exceed 1 hour, or it should be even lesser than that. But the cream population comes for older children and adolescent. Here, it is very difficult to define the screen time because of the demanding life that the kids are educationally facing. So it is important to teach them how to balance the screen time with other activities, like at least an hour of physical activity, adequate duration of sleep, and time for schoolwork, meals, hobbies, and family time. There is a definite role of authorities, which I feel as an eye care professional, we can suggest to the government to take care of a proper home-based learning curriculum and encourage learning and not just online education. Taking breaks from outdoors. Yeah, just a bit. There's role of doctors, as we all know, regular eye examinations and myopia treatment. Apart from this, it is important if some child is on a pharmacological treatment like atropine, there should not be a lapse in the treatment. 20-20 rule, I'll just quickly say that it is basically 20 minutes spent using a screen. You should try to look away at something that is 20 feet. And why? For a duration of 20 seconds. So finally, my take-home message would be that the counseling should not be just for the children, but for parents also. We as doctors should insist on digital hygiene because this is the new way of life. And now this seems inevitable and the new normal. So rather than telling them to reduce the screen time, it would be appropriate to teach them how to use screen properly. Simple patient education in the form of good lighting, good posture, and emphasis of Rule 20-20-20 would go a long way. We should explain the role of a positive screen time to children rather than just taking away the entire screen time. And there should be emphasis on periodic and regular refraction. We should start pharmacological treatments apart from appropriate spectacles in suitable patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aarti. That was a wonderful discussion. And I would actually like to continue with the question, with the topic that we've ended. I wanted to know your experience in the requirement of low-dose atropine, and have you observed any trend in what patients required for controlling the progression of myopia, and whether the low-dose atropine patients had lower progression that you noted during the pandemic.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence.
So if you had children who were coming in on low-dose atropine, did you notice that their progression in the pandemic was lower versus the children who were not on low-dose atropine? Like newly diagnosed, or you felt that earlier they were not progressing, but they progressed more during the pandemic?
Yes, I feel definitely low-dose atropine has definitely played a role, and there is significant less progression in these children. So I would rather emphasize on starting low-dose atropine to all suitable children, whoever fit in that criteria.
So have you altered any of your protocols for starting with low-dose atropine now? After seeing your...
to be honest, because of lack of ability of patients to reach the hospital periodically or regularly, more or less, we are starting it in all general patients who are in the suitable age group and who do not have any direct contraindications. We are starting it for all the patients now.
Wow.
Assuming that they will not be able to have a very, very periodic follow-up, just to be on the safer side.
So everyone who is myopic, you all are starting on low-dose atropine.
Yes, it's not a flat rule, but definitely we do take in consideration the other factors also.
Got it.
Like overall, the compliance of the patient, how periodically they'll be following up, is there family history of myopia? Like if they are high-risk people, definitely we will start them.
Perfect. Yes. So we did have a small study that was done at our center here, and what they noticed was also that the children who were on low-dose atropine were quite protected during the pandemic, versus the children who were not.
Yes.
Yeah.
One problem that I faced when prescribing low-dose atropine, my patient was unable to get it because probably in Aurangabad, many people are not using it. So when I wrote it out, the patient couldn't get it at any medical shop. So
there are many companies, madam. Now there are many companies.
I know, but I think the chemists were not stocking it because possibly there was no requirement coming for it from the ophthalmologist. So that could be the reason. I felt
there was a problem with the Myopin brand also, so they have stopped producing Myopin now. Basically,
I have also seen
so that was a problem, and they have now changed the name to Myoped. So mainly patients who have been prescribed Myopin, they really faced this problem a lot.
I've also seen sometimes chemists have given substitute of some other brands, atropine 1%, and then parents come back saying that the pupils are dilated and child cannot see anything. So I now insist and write in each and every prescription the percentage, and I counsel the parents to read up the medicine before they buy, that it should be 0.01%.
That is important point. You have to underline it actually. This is the percentage. It happens.
I think we have overshot our time because I think our session was till 3:30, but Ragini.
I have one more question, Dr. Shruti, because the next session, I've kept a buffer time. So next session is starting at 3:45. So one last question.
But before you take that last question, just I'm so sorry I forgot in the beginning of my talk to thank you, Hema, and to thank BOA and MOS for giving me this opportunity to talk today.
Dr. Rushabh, you have any question? One last question.
Yes, to Dr. Rebecca, I saw she mentioned about dioptic therapy.
Yes.
Do you routinely use it, and what are the patients in whom you advise them?
So basically,
within adults as well?
actually, so basically we did a thesis where we used a Tetris game. So where there are several games which are available, but not all of them are free of cost. So that's a limitation. So this Tetris game was available free of cost, and we had to provide anaglyph glasses to the patient. So you need to provide red and green glasses, or if the patient is affording, can buy it. It may be available online. So that's how, that we prescribe it. We do not prescribe it as a primary therapy. Rather, it is given as an adjuvant to occlusion, especially the cases which are responding slowly, are poorly responding, and have a little older age group, where this therapy is starting later on, maybe after 10 years of age or so. So there we see, and also the affordability, because at our center we deal with a lower socioeconomic background as well. A lot of people come from there, but smartphone is something which is now available with everyone. So that has eased things for us. So Tetris game is what we have used, sir, and we have found that yes, it definitely improves or helps as an adjunctive therapy. But again, compliance becomes an issue because the children, they get bored playing same type of game. It's a falling block game, so there is need for more engaging and different sorts of game.
So the same problem that I faced with one of my patients who was on this game, which I had advised them. The parents said that he's bored of it. It is so simple, and children nowadays can do more complex games, really. So maybe we need to sit down and devise some games for amblyopia for them.
Yes, ma'am. In fact, there are a lot of game, Dig Rush game also they tried, and some bugging squash, but there are very contradictory results. So probably we still need to devise and go ahead with evolve this technology further.
And again, then the question of affording these games which are to buy.
Priced ones, yes.
It's not free to download.
True.
Do you still prescribe Citimet or Citicoline for amblyopia?
Ma'am, Citicoline we had tried for the thesis. We found that, it was versus a placebo oral drug that was given as an adjunct to occlusion therapy. And 500 mg BD was a dosage because the patient were all more than 10 years, so 10 to 18 years. So we found it just, hastens the recovery, but the final visual outcome at the end of 6 months was the same. So it doesn't really make sense, exposing the children to those extrapyramidal side effects. So we have stopped using it.
Yeah.
Good comment on this. Ashwin, would you like to comment on the use of?
Yeah, I think mostly patients who have a failure of amblyopia therapy are mostly because either you have started too late or the compliance was an issue. So I think more than Dicoptic, just using regular games with occlusion, and you can give any game, increases the compliance of the occlusion, which is really the gold standard. And I just want to know, for those who have really failed occlusion and you've got an older child and they have still got unequal vision, do you then move to Dicoptic? Is that really better in those situations to gain a little more? In my experience, I'll just say I think I have found my patients gaining that little more with Dicoptic once they have done maximum occlusion with maximum compliance.
Exactly.
Which age group? Ashwin?
Yeah, beyond 8.
Okay, because my study for amblyopia, we try it at any age. The patient comes to you at 17 also, give it a shot.
I'm just saying once you have given up on occlusion and still you've got unequal vision, for those situations, that's my indication for Dicoptic.
Which software do you use, Dr. Ashwin?
No, so we have a center that has the Binox software, and I send it there. They do some in-house, few sessions in-house, and then they transfer it onto an online sort of mode.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think we should wind up now. Does somebody want to give a word of thanks?
I think Pooja can do it, or Isha.
Sunana ma'am, you do it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. As I said before, thanks to BOA and MOS for giving all of us, all of the speakers, and especially I see a lot of new faces in strabismology. I'm very happy to meet all of you because we want strabismology to develop further and further. Whether we are there or not, but it should remain. So thanks. Yes, Rebecca, you wanted to say something?
No, that.
She put up her finger.
Ma'am, I was just saying thumbs up. Thumbs up to you.
Okay, so thanks everybody. Thanks particularly to Emma.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.